Thank you for joining us today on our second of the Thomson Rogers virtual seminars. Apologize for some of you who haven't received the link back from Zoom. We're trying to get that fixed as we go through, but people that are emailing me, I'm sending you the link right away and getting them in. So today's session is number 2, called Virtual Cat Assessments. We're going to be covering can or should virtual cat assessments be done, how insurers are responding, what happens when virtual cat goes to lat. So, excited about today's topic. Our last session in this group is going to take place in 2 weeks, Friday, May 29th, when we're talking about best practices in reporting for a virtual world. Along with welcoming everybody here today, if anyone's had a chance to see Seinfeld's latest Netflix Netflix show, he starts out about how hard it was for everyone to get there today. We're all looking forward to those days when it's hard for us all to get together again. This is the best we can do for now, so thank you for joining us. Len and Stacey are going to be today's presenters. They're both partners with Thomson Rogers, and we've had Matthew Sutton, an associate with the firm, join us as well. Matt's going to be responding to questions and answers. He's going to be responding to chats, and then he'll interrupt Len and Stacey as need be when we feel a question is worthy for the entire audience. There are no slides today. It is just Len and Stacey talking. We are recording the session. We'll share the sessions with everybody once we're done next week, along with responses to any of the questions that we don't get to, or that we feel that there's a little bit more explanation that we can give you. Finally, as I said, if you do have questions, please use the Q&A tool. It's a little bit easier for Matt to answer those than it is for him to answer the chat, but we are able to monitor both. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Len and Stacey, and I hope everyone enjoys today's session.
Thanks, Mark. Welcome, everybody. And thanks, everybody, for taking the time out of your Friday morning to join us again. Hopefully, we'll be able to give you some information that you find useful and helpful in your practice right now. As we know, yesterday, the Ontario government made an announcement with respect to phase 1 for reopening the province. And included in that announcement was the resumption of certain in-person health services. I think the specific wording was people who do in-person counseling, including psychologists and addiction counseling. They haven't really expanded too much on the list, so we can't say for sure whether or not someone like an occupational therapist or perhaps the neuropsychologist will be able to resume their in-person assessments. But for now, we're going to go on the assumption that that's not happening. Just a brief recap, we know that in order to be deemed catastrophic, there's a couple of different tests. At the 6-month or more anniversary date, if you have an upper severe disability or a lower severe disability, you can be deemed catastrophic. And this, of course, is based on the GOSE, the GOSE. Or if at 1 year or more you have a lower moderate disability, you'll also be deemed catastrophic. And of course, the third test that we've known for quite some time is the 55% whole person impairment at the 24-month anniversary. And I think it goes without saying that each of these particular tests present challenges for us when we're considering doing CAT assessments remotely. And Len, what are your thoughts with respect to the OT piece, the structured interview?
Well, in speaking with Dr. Ron Kaplan last week or 2 weeks ago after our first session, we talked a little bit about what he's doing at his CAT clinic, and they're still conducting CAT assessments. One of the most important factors that Dr. Kaplan pointed out, and I think it's something that we were thinking as well, is that the documentation that goes over to the CAT clinic before the CAT assessment takes place is more important than ever. So it's very important for the occupational therapists and each member of the team to make sure that there is a good record of the treatment being provided to the person, reports that update the condition, because the CAT assessor is going to have to rely on that information to a great extent, particularly when it comes to physical disability, because the CAT assessors at the current time are not able to do the physical assessment. From what I understand from Dr. Kaplan, they're managing to do all other aspects of the CAT assessment, but the physical assessment part is still a problem under the current restrictions.
Yeah, and I've had the same feedback from other CAT assessors that I've spoken to. I've also spent some time chatting to occupational therapists who are treating, who are also going ahead and doing the GOSI testing. And I think, as Len had said, documentation is important. So when you're doing, as a treating OT, when you're doing the structured interview under the GOSI, it's going to be important to document the protocols that you have in place for doing your remote interviews, and make sure, you know, that they are clearly set out in your report. And there was an interesting point that was raised to me by an OT recently, and going on the essential services list. At the time, OTs are currently on the essential list for urgent care only. So we have to, you know, we question whether or not there's an argument to be made that an in-home GOSI assessment could be considered urgent in circumstances where the client's health or function is going to decline, or in the case of the CAT assessment, it's a time-sensitive assessment, right? We've got the 6-month mark, we've got the 12-month mark. So in order to avoid a negative outcome, having an OT go into the home to do the assessment with appropriate PPE and social distancing protocols in place, it could be deemed an essential service. I think that with respect to the independence at home category, that's one category that can be friendlier, let's say, to doing the interview remotely. Obviously, you're going to have to take into consideration, you know, the level of assistance required to do the interview, and even talk about how this is analogous to the person's ability to look after themselves in the home. So if you've got a family member or a PSW who's there, who's assisting with setup, working the computer, you know, dealing with the camera, dealing with tech issues, those are all things that you can draw analogies to with respect to their inability to be independent in the home.
And in terms of the CAT assessors themselves, I think it's important that the more information that they have going into the CAT assessment, the more reports that they have, the more information they have about the progress of the client, the patient, that allows the CAT assessor to do a more in-depth interview and investigate the current functioning of the patient. From my understanding, most of the testing that would be done by a catastrophic clinic, so for instance, even the validity testing, that can be done online, and the CAT clinic can have one of their, the psychometrist or one of the members of the team observe the person taking the test to make sure that the results are valid. If they have any concerns about the validity, then it will require the CAT assessor to obviously set up some type of interview with the patient and go over the questions and the answers with any concerns that they may have, and try to satisfy themselves as to the validity. It's not really much different than in the normal CAT situation. If the CAT assessor has concerns about the validity, they'll probably contact counsel for the patient and say, you know, based on the validity testing that we observed and the responses, we have some concerns about validity, and maybe the CAT assessment won't proceed at that point.
And that's a very good point. You know, validity is going to be important, like Len had said, in the neuropsychological context, as well as, you know, the GOSI context for the treating OT who may be doing the testing, right? So you want to make sure that you're clear about the people who are in the room, right? Identify them in the report, get all that information up front, and of course, make sure to interview your collateral sources to make sure that you're getting all of the information that you need, recognizing that doing your assessment remotely is going to give you a very limited view of the person's surroundings, right? You're only going to see what the camera's pointed at. You're going to be missing out again on all of these little nuances around the house that you're not going to see if you're in person. What I think,
yeah,
sorry,
go ahead,
Len.
No, go ahead.
The second part of that question, which is the independence outside of the home, right? When you've got the community situational assessment being done, I know that the OSOT has released some guidelines dated May 4th, I think it is, 2020, that is starting to give some guidance in anticipation of being able to do in-person community care. And it all, it all makes sense, right? It follows the provincial recommendations, which is your self-monitoring, your patient screening, PPE, and maintaining the physical distance requirement, which in the circumstances of the community assessment, that could actually be something that's very helpful. Because now you're not going to be standing beside the client in the grocery store, right? You're going to be 6 feet behind them. You're going to be watching them try to navigate directional arrows in aisles and dealing with either A, they're going down the wrong way and perhaps people are confronting them, or people are coming at them, they're getting too close. There's going to be the anxiety of people who are not wearing their PPE. So this may actually give a really good opportunity to highlight the challenges your clients are going to have when they're out in the community.
Now, one of the questions that has popped up is how much detail is necessary in the reports that go to the Cat Assessor. And I think that, in the current environment that we're in, the more information that the Cat Assessors have, the better. So obviously, I think it's important for all of the healthcare professionals who are working with patients, trying to provide service remotely, to detail as much as possible how the patient and the client is progressing, how it compares to the way they're functioning. We hear a lot on the news and the media right now about how this isolation is affecting people from a psychological point of view, and that people are deteriorating psychologically because of the isolation and depression that goes along with that. So all of these sort of aspects are important to document. And as I said, the more information that the Cat Assessor has going into the assessment, it'll help them, particularly on the physical side, because as we said, if they can't do the physical assessment, they're going to be relying to a great extent on the reports that come out of the treatment team about how the person is functioning from a physical point of view.
Hi everyone, Len and Stacey. I've noticed with the question and answer a couple of themes here. One is, what is deemed to be essential or urgent to get our treatment providers who are listening today into the home as soon as possible. Some have suggested, perhaps there's a difference between psychological and neurological testing and how that should be approached in person. Social workers look like they want to get in. And then people are concerned about differentiating between COVID and non-COVID related injuries and issues. So those are the two things that I see coming up. Maybe you'd like to comment on.
Well, I think with respect to, what is essential, if there's going to be, if there's a deterioration in the client's situation, if they're, if we're talking about it from a psychological point of view, how is their anxiety? Are they living alone? Are they becoming suicidal? Are they dysregulating? All of those things are good arguments for what can be deemed essential to get you into the home. And I think with the, with the government's recent announcement yesterday about how in-person counseling is going to start to be permitted, I think there's an argument to be made that social workers would fall into that category. Len?
Yeah, it's interesting because the documentation released by the government is not very clear on what's included and what's not included in the personal care that is being permitted. So it's kind of hard to know how this is going to be interpreted. I think that, there are a lot of healthcare practitioners that are out there right now providing service, not just virtually, but trying to do it in an in-person way with appropriate social distancing. And I think that the government recognizes that is necessary. for a lot of people who require treatment and care. So I think that, you know, what they're trying to do is expand this, but very slowly. And it's going to be, you know, it's going to be a very individual situation. Each healthcare practitioner is going to have to, you know, look at the circumstances. There are going to be some clients, obviously, who don't want someone coming to their house because they're afraid of the virus, and they don't want to risk the chance of spread. So I think that it's going to be a very individual thing. But for, you know, for the Cat Assessor, I think that in this environment, the Cat Assessors themselves are going to have to do very careful interviews of the patients. They're going to have to, as they always do, look for patterns and inconsistencies and consistencies between the documentation and their own observations and their own testing, and be prepared to interview clients after the assessments and possibly re-interview the patients after some of the testing is done and some of the assessment is done. And you know, I think that way the Cat Assessors can get a fuller picture of what's going on and be more confident in their view. One of the concerns that Stacey and Matt and I all sort of thought about when we were talking about this particular presentation is the difficulty that arises if, you know, the injured party and their counsel are trying to do the assessment under this environment, under the sort of the virtual modified environment. And that by the time the insurer does their assessment, you know, the restrictions have been relaxed and they're able to do the actual in-person CAT assessment in the normal fashion. So how is that going to be dealt with if the matter goes to a LAT hearing? Is the virtual assessment going to be seen as less persuasive than the assessment done by the insurer? Stacey, do you have any comment on that?
No, I think it goes back. I think it's a very valid concern for all of us to have. And I think part of it goes back to making sure that your protocols are documented within the report. So you have to be very, very specific about what you've done and how you've reached your conclusions, how you made your observations. There may need to be a disclaimer in the report, perhaps a lightly worded disclaimer to say something along the lines of that, you know, you've done this remotely, but of course you're reserving your right, to go back in and to do a supplement report if necessary in order to shore up any weaknesses that you feel or limitations that you feel there may be to your opinion. And that's something that's important to discuss with the lawyer on the file as well, right? Perhaps before you do your report, make sure to reach out, talk to the people who have retained you. And if there are any concerns that you have about the way you did your assessment, or if there are any limitations that you think may need to be revisited, make sure to have that conversation with the person who retained you before finalizing your report.
I think that's a very good point. You know, a lot of people will be concerned about the funding aspect. Insurers, you know, are going to be reluctant to be funding sort of repeat collateral interviews or repeat interviews with the patient. I think that it's all, it has to be dealt with at the front end by counsel and by the various treatment providers, preparing the insurer for the fact that, you know, this is not the normal situation, and that, you know, further interviews may be required, more testing, or collateral interviews with family members, friends, you know, co-workers or employers, things like that, in order to get a proper picture of what's going on with the client. And, you know, it's a collaborative effort. You have to speak with the lawyer who is acting for the party. You have to speak with the insurer and make sure that everybody's on board and understands that because of the situation we're in, you know, insurers can't be so strict in, you know, limiting people to the $2,000 and saying, well, we're not going to permit any further assessments beyond, you know, the monetary limit that we've, you know, the legislation provides for. So as we indicated in our first webinar, my experience, and I think, Matt and Stacey, you can give us your views on this, but my experience, at least at this point, is that most insurers, and I would say the majority of insurers, have been quite cooperative in these circumstances. They understand that this is a difficult time. It's a difficult time for treatment providers and healthcare providers to be doing assessments. So, they've been more than happy to work with us and come up with appropriate ways to get through the process and allow everybody to do their assessments. You've got to remember, the insurers are in the same boat we're in. They've got the same difficulties in terms of getting assessments done, having them done, in this environment. So if they're being too difficult with plaintiff's counsel or with the plaintiff about how they permit the assessments to be done, it's just going to bite them when they try to do their own assessment.
No, it's very true. I've seen a couple of just good comments that have popped up through the chat as well. Laura had mentioned that it's a good idea for the CAT assessors to make sure to reach out to the treatment team, to do collateral interviews with them as well, not just the family members. And I saw that Colleen had indicated that the College for the Social Workers have announced that as of Tuesday, they'll be able to resume their in-person counseling. I think that just circles back to touch on a couple of questions that came up earlier. But in terms of the LAT hearing, Len is right. There could be some issues with respect to your findings being challenged by the other side if you've done yours in virtually versus the IE assessor who's done them in person. We'd like to think that the adjudicators perhaps will be a little bit more in tune with the circumstances, with the limitations that you have in doing your reports, and may take that into consideration, as opposed to what we've talked about in the past, which is if you don't see the person, as in some IEs when they do paper reviews, we use that to cross-examine and try to weaken their findings. But I think in this situation, we may have a little bit more leeway with the adjudicators as well. Len?
Well, I've noticed there is a comment from Dr. Kurzman that for a neuropsychological examination, he actually asked the insurer to withdraw his OCF 18 and resubmit it only after a personal or an in-person assessment could be conducted. And, and that may be the situation. There may be, situations where there has to be a discussion with the insurer saying that an assessment in this environment really is not going to do the job. And either you can do a preliminary assessment now, but once the restrictions are relaxed, that you're going to have to go back in and do a further in-person assessment, or try to delay the assessment until an in-person assessment can be done. So, again, it comes down to working with the insurer and trying to come up with the best possible way of dealing with this. I would be very surprised, but it could happen, but I would be surprised if LAD adjudicators or judges ever took the position that an assessment that was done in this environment that had to be done remotely or by virtual means would be seen as being less persuasive when we were restricted in the way that we are restricted. I think that would be very unfair to a plaintiff to treat those assessments as if they're some sort of lesser form of assessment. So, and the other thing that we've got to think about is that, a lot of the colleges already provide for this type of assessment and treatment. Video assessment or remote assessments are perfectly accepted by many of the colleges as a perfect form of treatment and assessment. So I don't think that insurers should have a huge problem with allowing the assessments to go on in this environment until we can get back to, sort of some semblance of normal.
Yep, no, definitely. Sorry, Matt,
Yeah,
go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to pipe in. I see another couple of themes in the question and answers. One was that I think the treatment providers are looking for some guidance on how to respond to symptomatology when it's coronavirus versus their regular type of symptoms. So for example, someone who has anxiety, if they're experiencing more anxiety because of the coronavirus or otherwise, how would you recommend the treatment providers in their reports and assessments demarcating between the two? And secondly, also just giving the occupational therapists and others guidance in terms of what to say when they are at a virtual assessment and can't necessarily do all of the things they would typically do, and how to reference that in the report as well.
Well, look, a person's ability to cope, is an important aspect of these type of assessments. And, everybody is dealing with this pandemic. And if a person is having difficulty dealing with, the situation that they're in right now, I think that's just indicative of the injury that they have. So I wouldn't distinguish between, well, this is COVID related or not related. I would simply say this person has, significant difficulty coping with isolation. They're easily depressed. They get more depressed if they're not able to engage in social activities. And because of what's going on right now with the COVID-19 restrictions, this is causing the person's condition to deteriorate. And one of our listeners has pointed out the College of OTs supports this type of remote service and considers it to be essential if a person's condition is going to decline without the treatment. So I think that, it's fair game to certainly say that certain people who have suffered injuries as a result of an accident are having difficulty coping with their injuries. And if the current situation that we're in makes it even more difficult for them to cope with their injuries and cope with the situation, that, to me, that's all part of their original injury. I wouldn't make a distinction and try to say, oh, well, this is COVID related, because I wouldn't want to see insurers trying to, distinguish between the two and say, oh, well, we're not paying for that, or we're not paying for treatment to deal with, increased anxiety that arises out of the current situation that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, I completely agree with Len, right? It's how you frame it. You don't want to report it as COVID's causing this person to have more depression, more anxiety, more challenges with dealing with isolation, right? You have to flip it the other way. It's got to be, they've got these issues as a result of the accident. It's documented that they were dealing with them beforehand. And now we have the COVID restrictions that are just making things worse. And I think it's, and I think it's a fair statement to say for everybody, right? We're all going to have our days where we get up and we're going to have challenges, right? Whether, it's us, feeling like getting up and going to work again today at home and going through the process. So it's completely understandable how someone who is in a, I don't want to say weaker position, but who have these impairments to be struggling even more so.
And, it goes back to a little bit of what we were talking about in our first webinar, that, treatment providers have to prepare the insurer for the fact that certain people are going to require additional treatment because of what's going on with COVID-19. And because of the isolation that has occurred, there's going to be an increase in depression and anxiety. And people aren't engaging in the normal functions that they would normally be doing. They're not even doing sort of some of the physical rehabilitation that they would normally be doing. So if a person's condition is declining because of that, they may need additional treatment. And I think from the CAT perspective, it's important that the CAT assessors pick up on that as well. There have been a number of cases. I was involved in one of them where we got the LAT or it was FISCO at that time, but we got FISCO to agree that as part of the CAT assessment, deterioration in condition over time can be taken into account in doing the CAT assessment. And I think that deterioration that is occurring because of the restrictions that we're facing right now is an equally important part that needs to be captured by CAT assessors if they're doing CAT assessments in this environment.
Len, I saw an interesting point Melissa had made. Sorry, Mark, I just saw you popped back in, but this is an interesting point, is that, if you do your CAT assessment at the 6-month mark, you submit it to the insurer, then the insurer does their assessment. At that point, we may be at the 12-month mark. The test is how it now is different, right? You've got a different criteria. You also have a criteria that could exclude you from being deemed catastrophic. How do the OTs or the CAT assessors rebut that? If you've got our report is at 6 months, but the IEs, by the time they get done, it's 12 months.
Well, that's a big problem, and I noticed a lot of people have sort of highlighted that issue about the delay that might occur because of what's going on right now. And I think that really is something the lawyer and the treatment providers have to sort of deal with the insurer, and it's really something for the lawyer, I think, to work out with the insurer in advance, that if the assessment is being done at the 6-month mark from the patient's perspective, and if there's going to be a delay because of all of what's going on right now, I think the lawyer has to make it clear to the insurer that you're using the same test, that you're using the 6-month test rather than the 12-month test, even though, by the time the insurer does their assessment, they may be closer to the 12-month mark. So I really think that's something that the lawyer is going to have to deal with the insurer and get that clarified from the outset, because that is something we were concerned about as well. Is all of what's happening right now, one of the big problems is it creates delay, and we don't want to be in a situation where a person we're assessing a person using the 6-month test, and then the insurer uses a different test because the assessments have been delayed because of COVID-19. So I think that's an important point, and something has to be worked out at the front end.
Yeah, no, of course. And not all insurers are going to be agreeable to that. And it may, from a strategic point of view, for having the treating OT or the CAT assessing OT to go back in to do a rebuttal report, it may give an advantage in that you can talk about what's happened between 6 months and 12 months. And hopefully there will be enough information to document that the person is actually still having these challenges and these struggles. And there'll be lots of collateral evidence to show over that period of time, right? We have an IE that's just a 12-month mark picture. So it may be a way to rebut it that way.
And if we ever find ourselves in the position where, the plaintiff has done their assessments under this current situation that we have right now, and by the time the insurer does their assessments, we're back to in-person assessments, I would certainly argue that as a rebuttal, we would be entitled to have our client re-examined in a personal interview and a personal assessment, because I don't think we should ever be in the situation where a client is put at a disadvantage because the assessments had to be done, during these unique times.
Awesome.
So I see we're at our 10:30 mark. It's amazing how quickly half an hour goes by. Hopefully, the information we've provided today has provided some useful information for you. Like we did with our first webinar, we're going to be posting the webinar and also posting sort of a summary of the questions and answers, because we haven't been able to get to all of the questions that people have posed. So we will be circulating something or posting something with the questions that we weren't able to get to, and providing a little more detail in those responses that we'll share with all of you. So thank you very much for attending. Hopefully we'll see you all again, or you'll hear us all again, I guess, on our next one at the end of May. And in the meantime, everyone take care, stay well. Let's hope that we're back to business as normal fairly soon. And
just to close off on what Len is saying, we both really appreciate all of your comments that you put out in the chat. We recognize that some of them are just, comments, sharing your experiences, talking about the challenges that you are dealing with. And both Len, Matt, and myself, we find them all very, very helpful. It's great to get some insight from you guys as to what you're going through, and it's great to see everybody chatting with each other. So please keep that up. It's an important part of what we're doing.
Absolutely. And when we're developing answers to the questions that we're going to circulate to everyone, we try to incorporate some of the information that we're getting from you about how each of you is coping with the situation right now, and experiences that you've encountered. So as Stacey says, feel free to share those with us, and we'll try to pass the information along. So thanks again. Take care, everyone, and we hope to see you again at the end of May.
Enjoy your long weekend.
Okay, have a good weekend. Bye.